Good evening, and welcome back to The Dead End. Tonight, we begin a journey into the mind of one of Britain's most chilling murderers, a man who would one day call himself the Crossbow Cannibal. But before the blood, before the horror, and before the cameras captured his final act, there was a boy. A boy who grew into a man shaped by violence, isolation, and an obsession with death itself. In this first episode, we will strip away the layers of Stephen Griffiths' life, from the day he was born, through his broken childhood, to the first disturbing signs that something inside him was very, very wrong. If you think evil is born in darkness, you may be right. But sometimes it begins in plain daylight, in the most ordinary of places. Stephen Sean Griffiths entered the world on Christmas Eve 1969 in the small market town of Dewsbury, West Yorkshire. On paper, there was nothing remarkable about his birth, but the world he was stepping into was already fractured. His parents' marriage did not survive the early years. By the time Stephen could truly understand the world around him, his father was already gone, estranged from the family for nearly a decade by the time Stephen would face his final arrest. Raised by his mother, alongside a brother and a sister, Griffith's early years were marked by an absence that would never be filled. The father figure, a guiding presence many children rely on, was simply not there. And in its place, a quiet void began to form. Those who knew the family described them as ordinary, but in Stephen's eyes, the ordinary seemed meaningless. He rarely smiled, rarely played. He seemed more comfortable in solitude than in company, often drifting off into long silences that made even those closest to him uncomfortable. From a young age, Stephen Griffiths seemed to exist slightly apart from the rest of the world, an observer watching others live their lives as though he were studying them rather than joining them. He wasn't the sort of boy to get into harmless trouble. Instead, his behavior carried a different weight, a kind of calculated menace. His temper was unpredictable, and when it flared, it was cold and deliberate, not wild or impulsive. By his teenage years, his interest in the darker corners of human nature began to surface. He read about violent crimes and infamous killers, not with fear, but with fascination. While other boys his age dreamed of cars, sports, or girls, Stephen seemed more captivated by the mechanics of cruelty. Then, the violence broke through. One day, without warning, the young Stephen Griffiths committed an act that shocked his small community. In an unprovoked attack, he slashed a supermarket manager with a knife. No theft, no argument, just sudden, cold-blooded violence. The court didn't see him as a misguided youth. This wasn't petty misbehavior. It was something far darker. Griffiths was sentenced to 3 years in prison. And here is where his trajectory truly began to take shape. Prison did not rehabilitate Stephen. It didn't break him down or teach him remorse. If anything, it gave him more time to stew. More time to cultivate the resentment and violent fantasies that already lived inside his mind. When he was finally released, Stephen didn't walk out as a changed man. In fact, it didn't take long for him to return to his old ways. Not long after, he was convicted again, this time for threatening a young girl with a knife. This wasn't just reckless anger. It was the calculated intimidation of someone who had already learned how to control and manipulate fear. The courts, now dealing with a repeat offender, began to look deeper into his mind, and what they found was alarming. Psychological evaluations in the early 1990s labeled Stephen Griffiths as a schizoid psychopath. This diagnosis painted a grim picture. A man detached from normal human emotion, unable to empathize, and capable of extreme violence without remorse. A man for whom human life was expendable. By the time Stephen was in his early 20s, the seeds of what he would one day become were already deeply rooted. He had learned how to hurt without feeling guilt. He had tasted control through fear. And in the quiet spaces between his crimes, his mind was obsessively turning over the same thoughts again and again. Thoughts of violence, domination, and death. Neighbors and acquaintances would later recall the unease they felt around him. But at the time, Stephen's story was just another criminal tale in a crowded system. No one, not the courts, not the community, not even his own family, could see just how far this darkness would grow. The darkness inside Stephen Griffiths didn't vanish when the prison gates closed behind him. If anything, it evolved. It matured. While some offenders leave jail determined to start over, Stephen walked out with a different ambition, not to reform, but to refine. He didn't just want to hurt people. He wanted to understand the mechanics of killing, the psychology of predators, the very anatomy of murder. And so, he turned his eyes towards education, but not as a way to better himself, as a way to sharpen his craft. Stephen enrolled at the University of Leeds, earning a degree in psychology. To most, this would seem like a sign of progress, a troubled man seeking knowledge. But Griffith's interest in the human mind was not rooted in compassion or healing. He didn't study to understand how to help. He studied to understand how to break. His fascination with serial killers was not casual, it was obsessive. He read case studies the way others read novels, dissecting the patterns, the mistakes, and the triumphs of the world's most infamous murderers. Every detail was fuel, every fact a tool. But Griffiths was not content to stop there. He took his education further, enrolling at the University of Bradford for a PhD in homicide studies. On paper, this made him an academic, a scholar. In reality, it made him something far more dangerous, a killer in training, hiding in plain sight. As his academic credentials grew, so did his online presence. Under the sinister pseudonym Then Pariah, Stephen began to construct an alternate persona, one unbound by societal norms, where he could openly indulge in his darkest fascinations.
Through this alter ego, he launched a disturbing website called The Skeleton and the Jaguar. The site was not a harmless curiosity. It was a shrine, a twisted museum dedicated to the veneration of serial killers and the glorification of violence. He posted content steeped in morbidity, weaving together images and writings that seemed to celebrate cruelty as an art form. To him, these killers were not monsters to be condemned, they were icons to be studied, even admired. And all the while, Stephen himself was carefully constructing the image of a man who was not only knowledgeable about murder, but destined to commit it. Offline, Griffiths was just as strange, perhaps even stranger. Neighbors in his Bradford apartment block came to know him by an unusual nickname, the Lizard Man. It wasn't just because he kept pet lizards. It was because he walked them, yes, walked them, on small leads, parading them outside as if it were the most normal thing in the world. Rain or shine, summer or winter, Griffiths was a constant figure in his neighborhood, draped in a long black leather coat and dark sunglasses, regardless of the weather. He rarely spoke, and when he did, his tone carried no warmth. To many, he was an eccentric oddity, a strange neighbor best avoided. But inside his flat, the true Griffiths was on display. His home was less a living space and more a shrine to violence. Crossbows leaned against the walls, their bolts neatly arranged. Samurai swords were displayed like trophies. Shelves sagged under the weight of books about infamous murderers, Bundy, Dahmer, Sutcliffe, each page worn from repeated study. It was a killer's library, a predator's lair. He wasn't just interested in murder, he was preparing for it. Every weapon, every book, every photograph, they weren't just possessions, they were pieces of a plan. And so, Stephen Griffiths drifted deeper into his own twisted world, half academic, half predator. The line between research and fantasy blurred until it disappeared entirely. Soon, the man who had spent years studying killers would step beyond theory. Soon, the world would see what happened when obsession took physical form. Because Stephen Griffiths was no longer content with study, he was ready for practice. By now, Stephen Griffiths was no longer a man lost in academic obsession. He had crossed the invisible line between theory and action. Everything he had studied, every violent fantasy he had nurtured, was about to be tested on living human beings. And for his hunting ground, he chose a place where the vulnerable walked under flickering streetlights, where the missing could go unnoticed for days. Bradford's red light district. At night, the streets of Bradford's sex trade were a place of shadow and silence, where deals were made in whispers and quick glances. For Griffiths, these women were not people, they were prey. He believed no one would come looking for them quickly enough. He believed they could vanish without sending shockwaves through society. In his warped mind, that made them the perfect victims. On 22 June 2009, Susan Rushworth, a 43-year-old mother and grandmother, disappeared. Susan had her struggles, a history of drug dependency, a life shaped by hardship, but she was known in her community as gentle, polite, and quietly resilient. That day, she was last seen in Bradford city center, walking alone. After that, she was simply gone. There were no screams, no signs of struggle, no immediate trail to follow. Police searched, family pleaded, but there was nothing. And somewhere in the city, Stephen Griffiths was learning just how easy it was to make a human being vanish.
During interrogation, Griffiths did not resist. In fact, he seemed almost relieved, as though capture had been part of his plan all along. His admissions came without bargaining or legal maneuvering. He claimed responsibility for all three murders: Susan Rushworth, Shelley Armitage, and Suzanne Blamires. He admitted to dismembering them with precision and disposing of their remains in the River Aire. For Susan Rushworth, no remains were ever found, a mystery that still lingers to this day. When asked why, his answer was cold, almost bored. "I've killed loads." Whether he was exaggerating or speaking the truth remains uncertain. Police never confirmed any additional murders, but the possibility still haunts investigators. Stephen Griffiths has gone from a shadowy figure in Bradford's underworld to a self-proclaimed monster basking in the spotlight of his own trial. His arrest didn't just end his killing spree, it cemented his place in Britain's modern criminal history. The world now knew the name Crossbow Cannibal, and Stephen Griffiths made sure of it. For Stephen Griffiths, the courtroom was never a place of redemption. It was a stage, and he was determined to play his role to the very end. The trial of Stephen Griffiths opened under the heavy shadow of his own self-made notoriety. Public curiosity was ravenous. Journalists lined the corridors, victims' families sat with faces hardened by grief, and the court's atmosphere was thick with both outrage and morbid fascination. The charges were clear and undeniable. the murders of Susan Rushworth, Shelley Armitage, and Suzanne Blamires. Each name represented a life stolen, a family shattered, and a piece of Bradford's heart ripped away. In most murder trials, the prosecution's task is to prove guilt beyond reasonable doubt. But here, there was no cat-and-mouse chase between lawyer and defendant. Griffiths had already confessed. There would be no twist ending, no surprise verdict. The only real question was, would he try to use the proceedings to feed his hunger for attention? On 21 December 2010, when the judge called upon him to enter his plea, Griffiths didn't hesitate. His words were flat, cold, and final. Guilty. It was the only time during the trial that the room seemed collectively to exhale. For the families of the victims, it was a grim relief. There would be no drawn-out hearings, no parade of witnesses forced to relive their trauma in front of him. But still, there was no comfort in his acceptance of guilt. Griffiths gave no apology, no acknowledgement of the pain he had caused, just a simple admission, as though the destruction of 3 lives was an administrative matter, a box to tick before moving on. The judge did not mince words when passing sentence. Griffiths was handed a whole life order, one of the harshest penalties in the British legal system. You will never be released from prison. You will die there. A whole life order meant there was no parole, no review, no hope of walking free again. For the public, it was a rare moment of justice served without loopholes. For Griffiths, it was unclear whether he considered this a punishment at all. Some suspected he had planned for this outcome. To him, prison might not be a cage, but rather a final, permanent podium from which he could exist as the Crossbow Cannibal for the rest of his days. Once locked away, the public eye moved on. But inside the prison, Griffiths' behavior ensured he never truly disappeared. In the months after his conviction, he attempted suicide multiple times. Each incident sent shockwaves through the prison staff. Some believed these were genuine acts of self-destruction. Others suspected they were another way for him to remain in control, to dictate when and how his life would end, to keep his name in the headlines even from behind bars. In 2011, Griffiths embarked on what would become one of the most extreme hunger strikes in British prison history. 120 days without solid food. His weight plummeted, his health deteriorated, and prison doctors were faced with an ethical nightmare. Force-feed a convicted serial killer to keep him alive, or let him waste away by his own hand. The hunger strike wasn't just an act of defiance, it was a performance. Griffiths made no demands. He wasn't protesting his conviction. He simply stopped eating. It was as if he wanted to slowly erase himself from existence, 1 calorie at a time. Because of the severity of his crimes and the threat he posed to both inmates and staff, Griffiths spent most of his prison life in solitary confinement. A small cell, a steel door, a bed bolted to the wall. The hours stretched endlessly. He was allowed minimal contact with others. The routine was repetitive, almost mechanical. Yet there were whispers among prison officers that Griffiths seemed to enjoy the monotony. It was quiet, controlled, and above all, it was a place where no one could take away the identity he had created for himself.
On 26 April 2010, Shelley Armitage, a 31-year-old woman described as bubbly and kind-hearted, was last seen by a friend near her home. Like Susan, Shelley also worked in the city's red light district. When she failed to contact her family, alarm bells began to ring. But again, there was no clear trace, no crime scene, no witnesses willing to step forward. What no one knew was that Shelley's final moments had already played out behind the closed doors of Griffiths' flat, where his fantasies were becoming routine. Then came 21 May 2010. Suzanne Blamires, 36 years old, vanished after a brief encounter with Griffiths. Unlike the others,
her disappearance would not be a silent mystery. For the first time, the predator made a fatal mistake, one that would leave behind undeniable proof of his crimes. Inside the high-security building where Griffiths lived, CCTV cameras silently recorded the movements of residents and visitors. That day, the grainy footage captured Suzanne entering Griffiths' flat, and she never came out alive. It saw her panic, saw her try to escape. It saw Griffiths strike her, knocking her unconscious, and then it saw him retrieve a crossbow, calmly loading it, aiming, and firing into her skull at point-blank range. There was no rush, no hesitation. This was a man entirely at home with murder. In the days that followed, parts of Suzanne's remains began to surface in the River Ire. The grim discoveries did not stop there. Further searches uncovered remains belonging to Shelley Armitage as well. But for Susan Rushworth, the first to vanish, there was nothing. No body, no bones, no trace. It was as if she had been erased from the earth. The murders revealed a disturbing pattern. Griffiths lured his victims with apparent friendliness, only to strike suddenly and without warning. Once they were dead, he dismembered them, disposing of the remains in waterways, knowing the current would carry away both evidence and suspicion. He had blended his academic knowledge of killers with his own methods, refining each kill as if it were an experiment. But experiments, by their nature, are observed. And Stephen Griffiths was about to find out that someone had been watching the whole time. Tonight, the mask of the predator comes off, and what stands before us is not just a killer, but a man who wanted the world to remember his name no matter how dark the legacy. The streets of Bradford had been plagued by whispers for months. Women vanished without a trace, and fear rippled through the red light district like an invisible predator stalking its prey. But when Stephen Griffiths was finally unmasked, the world didn't just meet a murderer. They met a man who rebranded himself in real time as something darker, something out of a nightmare. The courtroom was hushed when Griffiths first appeared in the dock. Cameras flashed, reporters leaned forward, and when asked to confirm his name, he didn't answer with the soft, shaking voice of a man ashamed. No. Instead, with an almost theatrical calm, he uttered words that sent chills through the room. The Crossbow Cannibal. It was as if he had been rehearsing that moment, as if the trial was merely another stage upon which he could perform his twisted theater of notoriety. This was not a slip of the tongue or a cryptic reference. It was a calculated brand, a deliberate attempt to carve his infamy into the public consciousness. Stephen Griffiths had read about killers all his life: Ted Bundy, Jeffrey Dahmer, Peter Sutcliffe, and now he was placing himself in their ranks. The Crossbow Cannibal moniker was his creation, a grotesque badge of honor he wore proudly. It spoke to the brutality of his crimes and the sheer audacity with which he committed them. In police interviews, he spared no detail when discussing his murders. There was no visible shame, no hesitation. He admitted to killing his victims, to cutting them into pieces, to disposing of their remains, and then, in what would become the most infamous claim of his confessions, he casually alluded to cannibalism. According to his own statements, he had consumed parts of his victims' flesh. Whether out of ritual, curiosity, or simply to cement his notoriety, he never explained. Police were left with no doubt. Griffiths wasn't interested in remorse. He was interested in leaving a legend. It all unraveled on 24 May 2010. Suzanne Blas-Maurice's brutal murder had been caught on CCTV from inside Griffiths' flat. The footage was chilling. It showed Suzanne entering his flat. Moments later, she staggered back out, visibly injured. Then, Griffiths appeared,
crossbow in hand. The arrow pierced her skull with clinical precision. But it wasn't just the act itself. It was what happened next that left investigators stunned. The footage showed Griffiths walking casually past the cameras, carrying what appeared to be a crossbow bolt, as if this was just another mundane evening in his life. Police moved in quickly. Officers stormed his apartment and found what could only be described as a shrine to murder. Walls lined with books on serial killers, racks of weapons, and the lingering smell of decay. In the kitchen, forensic teams found traces of blood matching his victims. In his freezer, rumors swirled that disturbing discoveries were made, but official statements remained careful.
The name Crossbow Cannibal still haunts Bradford. For the families of his victims, the knowledge that he will never walk free brings some security, but no peace. Even in prison, Stephen Griffiths remains a shadow in the public consciousness. His trial and sentence marked the end of his crimes, but not the end of his story. Because the most terrifying thing about Griffiths wasn't just what he did. It was that even when stripped of freedom, stripped of his weapons, and locked away for life, he still found a way to make the world watch him. The prison gates may have closed on Stephen Griffiths, but his story did not end there. If anything, the shadows around him seemed to deepen. From the moment he entered the high-security prison system, Griffiths became both a figure of morbid curiosity and a walking target. Inmates knew who he was. Some feared him, others despised him. Word of his crimes spread like wildfire through cell blocks and corridors, and the details, sex workers, dismemberment, cannibalism, were enough to guarantee that he would never be left in peace behind bars. One of the most notable incidents came when Griffiths was attacked by another inmate, reportedly a friend of one of his victims. The assault left him with severe facial injuries, bruises, cuts, and swelling that prison medical staff worked quickly to treat. It was far from the first time, and it wouldn't be the last. Within prison walls, the nature of his crimes placed him in the same category as child killers and other despised offenders, men marked for vengeance. Reports began to emerge from staff and fellow inmates. Griffiths lived in a state of constant caution. At times, he was placed in protective custody, but even there, threats persisted. The prison environment was volatile, and the man once feared on the outside was now prey in a closed world of grudgings and whispered payback. But perhaps more disturbing than the attacks were the words Griffiths himself continued to speak. To several people, some fellow inmates, some mental health professionals, he claimed his known victims were just the tip of the iceberg. He hinted at loads more murders, sometimes smirking when pressed for details, other times going silent, as if savoring the power of the mystery. These claims, never confirmed, planted seeds of dread in investigators' minds. Were there other women whose disappearances would never be solved? Were their bones still buried, or bodies still hidden in places only Griffiths knew? The unease wasn't limited to the prison system. Back in the building where Griffiths had lived, residents continued to talk. Some spoke of strange, acrid smells in the hallways during the months of the killings, odors that made them gag, but that they dismissed at the time as bad plumbing or rotting rubbish. Others described vivid nightmares that began after the murders came to light, dreams of shadowy figures moving in the corridor, or of faint knocking on their doors late at night. Even after Griffiths was locked away, the building carried an almost tangible heaviness, as if the walls themselves remembered. Griffiths' crimes carved their place into the public's imagination, and his cold, remorseless demeanor ensured he wouldn't be forgotten.
He became a fixture in true crime media, appearing in television documentaries like Killers Behind Bars 2013, and dissected in detail in countless podcasts, including episodes of Morbid. His online alter ego, then Pariah, continued to fascinate criminologists and cybercrime experts, serving as a chilling reminder of how the internet can be used to cultivate and glorify violence. In interviews and studies, psychologists cited Griffiths as a rare example of a killer who openly courted infamy. He didn't kill to hide his actions, he killed to showcase them, to create a name that would echo through the annals of British crime. The story of Stephen Griffiths is more than a macabre tale for shock value. It's a grim reminder of the signs we often overlook. His early violent tendencies, obsession with serial killers, and blatant disregard for human life were red flags that blared long before his final arrest. Yet in each phase of his life, opportunities to intervene were missed or dismissed. From this, one takeaway is clear: evil often grows in plain sight, camouflaged by eccentricity, hidden behind closed doors, or ignored because it seems too extreme to be real. This is why communities, friends, and institutions must take threats and disturbing behavior seriously. Prevention starts with vigilance, and silence can be deadly. And so, with Griffiths locked away for the rest of his life, the Crossbow Cannibal remains a chilling figure, a man who blurred the lines between reality and horror, who treated murder as a twisted performance. His name is etched in Britain's darkest history, but the shadow of his crimes still lingers. In our next episode, we'll step into another case, one equally disturbing, where the killer's cruelty went beyond what investigators thought possible. A story that will make you question how much we truly know about the people living next door. This is The Dead End, and the road ahead only gets darker.